Good morning. This is Anna Siefken, and very glad to have you joining us in our continuing webinar series, Energy Resilience and COVID-19. We continue during the course of this year to look forward to how we're going to manage through recovery. So many different circumstances all at once. I'm Anna Siefken. I'm the Executive Director for the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm very glad to have you here. Just going to talk for a minute or two about the Scott Institute, sort of what our goals are. But I do want to start first by thanking, continuing to thank, as we see spikes of COVID-19 across the country, thank all of our frontline workers, our healthcare workers, and those that are keeping the energy flowing. Special shout out to family and friends in New Orleans today. Obviously, they've gone through a pretty rough night last night. So the Scott Institute is really interested in collaborative research, strategic partnerships, education, entrepreneurship, and policy outreach. So this topic today sort of bridges all of those together. We have a PhD, a recent PhD from Carnegie Mellon University as our speaker. And she is going to talk to us about an important topic in nuclear energy. So our focus overall is moving towards a sustainable, lower carbon energy future. I do want to let you know that we have an annual report that was just released about 2 weeks ago. It's on the front page of our website, cmu.edu/energy. So you can learn more about our 3 main areas of focus: technology, efficiency, and computation. It's the stuff that Carnegie Mellon does best in energy. So the purpose of these webinars, as I mentioned, is to bring together thought leadership to talk about important topics, to have an informative dialogue, and to sort of understand strategies as we prepare for our collective energy future. So speaking of collectives, Good Energy Collective is our guest speaker today, Jessica Levering. I'll introduce her in just a few minutes. But the purpose and the content today is around rethinking nuclear policy from the ground up. So we will be talking about her new organization and all they are trying to accomplish. There are other events that are upcoming for us. We have a full calendar between now and the end of the semester. I'll talk in a minute about our November 12th event that's upcoming, but I do want to let you know that Denise Gray, who's the president of LG Chem out of Michigan, is going to be giving a distinguished lecture on electrification, EVs, and mobility and transit on November 17. We are partnering with the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon to bring forward their Technology, Sustainability, and Business event. That's on November 20th, a Friday. We have another distinguished lecture, interestingly enough, on nuclear with Rita Baranwal, who's the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy in the Department of Energy. She's going to be talking about enhancing flexible, dispatchable electricity. And then finally, our last event of the year is a roundtable with the Chief Resilience Officer from the city of Pittsburgh, Grant Irvin, and the Danish Energy Agency, who are going to be talking about the city of the future, particularly as it pertains to Pittsburgh's district energy planning, both in 2020 and into 2021. So as I mentioned, we have that event on November 12th. And this is a fascinating panel that's coming together between our kind of the regulatory side of solar deployment, as well as the legal side, and then from the commercial side. So we're very interested in having you participate in this discussion about how we can increase the amount of community scale solar in Southwestern and actually all of Pennsylvania. So if you're interested in hearing more about these events, there's a lot of ways to connect with us. You can register to receive our emails on our website, which is cmu.edu/energy. You can follow us on these different social media handles, and you can also send us an email. That's our sort of general email inbox. And if you have a suggestion for a speaker, we are currently working on our speakers for the spring. So if you have a suggestion, please contact my colleague, Daniela. So with that, I want to say a special thank you to Good Energy Collective for partnering with us on the event today. With us, we have Jessica Levering, and she is the Good Energy Collective co-founder. She is completing her PhD, or I should say has completed her PhD, has recently defended, in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. So her dissertation focuses on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how very small nuclear reactors could be deployed at the community level. So she is a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub in DC and was formerly the director of the energy program at Breakthrough Institute in Oakland, California. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank
I'm
you
actually
for
going
having
to
me.
pull my slides down so that we can just be together. So with that, Jessica, tell me about Good Energy Collective. Tell me about what you all are trying to accomplish, what your sort of vision is, and how this organization might be different from other players already in the nuclear space.
Yeah. So again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak to everyone today. So the background story of how we started Good Energy Collective was that everyone who's involved, me and my co-founder, Suzanne Baker, and our founding board chair, Rachel Slabaugh, we've all been working in nuclear for several years. I've been more on the policy side, Susie from other think tanks and formerly Idaho National Labs and Department of Energy. We'd all been working in nuclear, but noticing that something was missing. And in particular, there are a lot of groups doing great work on nuclear policy, particularly in DC, from a nonpartisan, a bipartisan, and a pretty centrist point of view. And they've been really successful. But what we're seeing starting last year and building up this year was a big focus and a lot of momentum around the Green New Deal and sort of big climate legislation. So really aggressive, I would say ambitious climate legislation. And that was really exciting to us, and seeing all these new climate organizations pop up, especially young progressive organizations pop up around this and really gain strength. And we just noticed that nuclear wasn't really in those conversations. And it felt like a natural fit. If you're going to do a big climate bill, something like the Green New Deal, it makes sense for us for nuclear to be in there. But there's a lot of reasons that it wasn't. Nuclear isn't very popular on the political left with these progressive groups. So we wanted to start a new organization that really built out what progressive nuclear policy would look like and really make the case for nuclear with from a progressive angle. So that was our personal kind of view, but we felt like there was a need for this in the policy ecosystem, because there is a really good group on the right that does nuclear and climate policy. That's ClearPath. And so we felt like we needed a new organization that was really focused on that, rather than, try to rebrand nuclear or a new PR campaign. We really wanted to do genuine engagement with these progressive groups working on climate legislation, and also develop new policies for nuclear that would really couch it in a broader climate framework that really takes environmental justice seriously, social justice seriously. And that's what we weren't really seeing with the current organizations working on nuclear policy. It's very technology focused, very innovation focused, which we think is great. There's been a ton of success with nuclear innovation, but now we think it's time, when some of these companies are starting the licensing process, that we need to start thinking about, okay, how are we actually going to build these? How are we going to get community support, community buy-in for these projects? And we felt like there needed to be a new organization to do that work. And so that's why we founded Good Energy Collective. And we launched in August. So sort of just getting rolling.
So it's interesting that you mentioned those different things that need to be accomplished. So have you started to unpack each of those different ones? I mean, how are we going to get this moving forward?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically? Let's sort of dig into what those are. I mean, we know ClearPath, and it's interesting that you're saying it's sort of on the opposite side. So that would be my second question: is how is it different, and how is the approach different?
Yeah. So I would want to start by saying, to do a big climate legislation, like a Green New Deal, is going to be hard to get that through Congress. And so you really need a broad coalition of support. So even for people who are interested in nuclear, support nuclear, but aren't necessarily on the political left, they saw the need that there needs to be a group engaging with the progressive groups around nuclear. It wasn't going to work for some of the existing organizations to try and do outreach to these new progressive climate groups. But some of the things that are needed that we've seen is more of a focus on the social science research agenda. So we've had so much good investment from Department of Energy in technological innovation to getting these new advanced nuclear designs ready for commercialization, ready for licensing. But there still needs to be a lot of work on how you actually engage with communities that are hosts, because the nuclear industry doesn't have a great record for community engagement in the past. There's a lot of sort of, and not just nuclear, sort of all large power plants in the past, like we're going to build it here, deal with it. And local communities around nuclear power plants do have a lot of support and really high public approval now. But for advanced nuclear, what we were worried about is that just having new technologies isn't really going to change people's perception of nuclear. The whole process needs to be different. They need to feel like they have ownership over the process. So we're working to develop what policies for what it looks like to have proper community engagement for some of these, specifically the first demonstrations of advanced nuclear, because we really need to get it right from the start. If we have sort of a project that gets canceled or it goes for a while and then the community decides like we don't want it, that would be really bad and sort of set advanced nuclear back. So we need to have really successful first demonstration projects. So we're looking at what's needed in terms of financing, local workforce training, siting, what the process needs to look like to have genuine not just community approval, but really buy-in so that, things don't change down the road. For something to be sustainable, you really need to have that community support. And so we're building out a policy at different levels, different branches of the government. So we put out a policy paper with recommendations. But some of the things we're looking at to start with are focusing on frontline communities, those that'll be both affected the most from climate change, but also from an energy transition. So some historically fossil communities. And some of where we've already seen support for the work that we want to do is in particular, the Biden campaign did this Biden Sanders Unity Task Force recommendations, and they're on a bunch of different policy areas, but their climate recommendations, they do mention advanced nuclear a few times, which is a big deal that it has, Bernie Sanders' name on it because he's been historically very anti-nuclear. But in this Unity Task Force recommendations, they do mention advanced nuclear a few times, and specifically they say that the federal government should invest in advanced nuclear as long as it's addressing the historical problems that nuclear's had in the past. And so that's really where we want to be working, is not ignoring nuclear's problems, but saying, okay, nuclear has some problems, particularly a lot of environmental justice problems in the past around mining, a lot of issues around the weapons complex, but that's still nuclear to most people. And so how can we address those issues in a meaningful way and make progress while working towards building out these first demonstration projects and getting those rolling? So it's more about developing more holistic policy. So not just thinking, okay, we need to license the design and then build the design. It's how do we do a community level project that really addresses all the issues and make sure everyone's really on board. So, okay, I've been talking a lot, but that was our motivation, and that's sort of the first policy work that we're doing over the first year.
So there's a lot of questions that come up in what you've said so far, and I do want to encourage our guests today to use the Q&A. You can ask additional questions. We have some that came in advance that I want to sort of focus on, but there were quite a few different things that sort of came up in what you were just saying that I want to ask before we get to some of these questions that came in previously. So you talked about advanced nuclear, you talked about community scale. So can you like define a few of those things? Because I know that we have perceptions, and that was actually one of the questions, is how do we change the perceptions that people have? And you mentioned that as a goal. So what is the scale that we're talking about? How is it different from what we've seen in the past? And what are some of your ideas about changing perception?
Yeah, so
3 big questions.
first of all, just to define advanced nuclear for those that are not as familiar with the term, it's really broad. It basically means anything that's not the nuclear technologies that we're operating today. And it even goes beyond the projects that we have under construction in the US right now, the AP1000s down in Georgia. So it's mostly things that are not water cooled, so non-light water reactors. But also we include small modular reactors in that broad umbrella. And some of those, actually a lot of those are light water reactors. So just anything that's different than what we have today. So light water reactors, small modular reactors, but also, gas cooled reactors, salt cooled reactors, sodium cooled reactors, fast reactors, really anything that's not our standard large scale light water reactor. And then coming to size, because I keep using the phrase community scale. There are a lot of different sizes of reactors in advanced nuclear, but a lot of them are tending to be smaller, sort of under 600 megawatts. There's a lot around the kind of 300 megawatt range. And then there's a whole class that are really small. So what are called microreactors, which is what I focused on in my dissertation. So those are under 10 megawatts. That's really tiny for nuclear. That's like the size of some large wind turbines. And physically they're very small too. So fitting in like 1 to 2 shipping containers. So that really changes the paradigm around nuclear. And so there's been some ideas or hypotheses in the engineering communities and in the nuclear innovation communities that, these new designs are really improved in a lot of ways. They're intrinsically safe. They have these passive safety features. Some of them are much simpler, so they could be much cheaper. They're much smaller, so they lend themselves to factory fabrication, so that could make them much cheaper as well. They could be much faster to build. And there's this thought that with all of these, wonderful attributes, they'll just have better public support from the start. And we're just a little worried that that won't be the case, because there's a lot of complicated reasons that people don't like nuclear. And some of them aren't really addressed by these new designs, like historical and legacy issues around atomic weapons testing. That doesn't really change when you have new designs. So we want to go about approaching them and to make sure that they are actually built and deployed in a new way as well that gets community buy-in, because they do have these new attributes that would be really great if they're built. So trying to make the process, the commercialization process, match the innovation on the engineering side. So specifically with really small reactors, that's just a very different business model than we've seen before. You don't have to be a huge investor in utility to be able to afford these reactors. And that's something that's maybe is changing people's perception, particularly around from the progressive side and these new climate organizations. When we've been talking to people in these groups, they're open to nuclear. They know that we need sort of all of our options for low carbon energy if we're doing this total economy-wide decarbonization. But, they're pretty justified in saying, yeah, we probably need nuclear, but who could afford to build, a 1 gigawatt plant, which is true. Seeing what's happening down in Georgia, the Cancel plant in South Carolina. it would be really hard for any utility to afford such a large project. And so moving towards smaller, that opens up the potential customers, the utilities that could afford a project. And so that really changes, it changes the market. It opens up to much more diverse customers. And that means we also need to change some of our processes, because historically having a large utility did make some things easier. You know, they have a lot of lawyers. They've built a lot of big projects before. They know how to finance them. They know how to go through the regulation. And that could be a lot more challenging for smaller, you know, a municipal utility, a rural electric co-op. They don't have those sort of capabilities to build a big project. So making things smaller can help them, but we still need to have more sort of modularization on the financing side, on the licensing side, so it's not you know, has to be redone for every project. So it's great to have factory fabrication for the technology, but you need to have, you know, licensing and financing that also match that model.
So a couple of questions are coming in. So thank you all for sending questions through Q&A. I know that we have a lot of questions. We may not get to all of them today, but we'll try. So I have a question that's come in from John Melinda. Thank you, John. It says, when making your advocacy pitch for nuclear power and responding to the argument that it's not financially competitive, do you ever make the point that nuclear power faces a non-level playing field vis-a-vis regulatory burden? If all sources were regulated to a common public health and safety goal, such as premature morbidity or mortality per megawatt hours of power generated, it would be far more economical than coal or even natural gas. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely, nuclear is in a really unique place, because it's thought of in most, you know, power sector, it's really thought of as basically a fossil fuel. It's a large thermal power plant. And it doesn't get a lot of the support and benefit that renewables get for being low carbon, even though it is low carbon. And so that's something where we feel it's really important not to have, you know, subsidies or policies that just support nuclear, like nuclear focused policies. We want to have develop broader, really ambitious policies focused on carbon dioxide, because they will help nuclear, but it also will help to couch nuclear along with renewables. So yes, we agree. It would be great to level the playing field, particularly recognizing the low carbon and the low just air pollution in general, particulates, you know, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, that nuclear doesn't have any of that. So really, you know, nuclear is not competing with renewables. It's really fossil fuels, and particularly natural gas, that are making it challenging for existing nuclear, for new nuclear. And so with a big, with any sort of regulation on greenhouse gas emissions, you would see that playing field level a little bit. So that's how we're viewing it, as absolutely you need to be crediting nuclear and renewables for their low carbon benefits equally, but also actually starting to put limits on greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels in the power sector and the transportation sector. And that will help nuclear along with everything else. But nuclear hasn't benefited from those sorts of subsidies in the past.
So when talking though about nuclear and decarbonization, and there are a couple of questions that have come in, so I can't not ask about waste, because there is the issue of waste that doesn't exist. So how is that being handled with these smaller, like the small modular, or some of the other sort of smaller scale ones that you're talking about? How is the waste sort of not only disposed of, but sort of comparable to the sort of traditional nuclear power plant?
Yeah, so there's a lot of diversity in designs. That's something that will be a challenge commercialization wise for these advanced reactors. There's a lot of different fuel types. So I can't give you a single answer, but I will say, no matter what, we need to come up with a solution for spent nuclear fuel and nuclear waste in the US. And that's something that I think makes our organization different, is we see that as critical to nuclear being successful commercially going forward. So sometimes, particularly with a lot of the pro-nuclear organizations, tend to dismiss waste as, well, it's not a technological problem. It's not really causing any harm. It's pretty safe, these are all true, but it is a huge obstacle for public acceptance of nuclear power, that we don't know what to do with our waste. It's just sitting at power plants around the US. And so we feel there really needs to be movement towards a solution on nuclear waste. And what that solution looks like is up for debate. So I think one thing that we recommend in our kind of broad policies is to do a commission a big study through the federal government on the full fuel cycle and what the different options are in the US, and what would be the best choice for dealing with spent nuclear fuel. Because there's a lot of people pushing for recycling, which is what a lot of other countries, especially the big nuclear countries, do, like France. But then there's concerns around security when you start doing reprocessing. And so how to balance those, because for nuclear to be sustainable, we really need to do something with that spent fuel. But on the other hand, it's a really valuable resource. I mean, there's a lot of energy still in nuclear waste. That would be great to harness. And if we could harness it, we get centuries more energy out of it. So it's a waste in two different senses. So we definitely feel like there needs to be movement on that. And I think that's where it really is valuable to be making bridges to the progressives and the traditional left side of the political spectrum, because they really care about waste. And so making that bridge to, well, if you want to see nuclear going forward, if you want to see really aggressive decarbonization of the full energy system, you need to come up with a solution for nuclear waste. It's not a separate problem. And so that also can bring progressives on board, because for a lot of them, it's, well, I would support nuclear, except what about the waste? And so if you're actually, okay, like, yeah, let's partner and let's work on finding a solution for that waste, that can really bring people on board. If it's not just, a stalemate where we don't know what to do with it, but let's, no one wants to move forward on big commercial projects without a solution on waste.
So a question has come in on, obviously we have a big election coming up next week. And so the role of nuclear and nuclear policies are very different. And between these two parties. And you've mentioned that a little bit in terms of kind of leanings and the way people are thinking about it. So the plans for nuclear are not consistent. So based on your work with Good Energy Collective, where do you see energy innovation sort of with each of those paths over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So we've been kind of waiting to see what happens with the election to decide where we're going to push, because it does look very different, particularly in the executive office. So with the Biden administration, based on the climate plans that he's put out already, notably that they're climate plans, and very ambitious climate plans. So full decarbonization of the power sector by 2035. That's really ambitious. And you can't do that without nuclear. So if Biden's elected, it does look like there would be some big climate legislation early on. And so we would be focused there on, not just making sure that nuclear is included, which it would be, but making sure that it has the right sorts of supports, the right sorts of funding for community engagement, pushing on making progress on nuclear waste. Those sorts of things were included. So thinking more, when you have a big legislation piece like the Green New Deal, you do want to get a lot of different things in there. So much more holistic policy, not just, X billion dollars for the first demonstration, but, funding a social science research agenda around nuclear and things like that. So I think if Biden is elected, we'll be pushing much harder through that. And particularly, Biden has proposed a climate office in the White House. And so having sort of nuclear representation there and making sure that nuclear is a focus in the administration. That would be our target. If Trump's elected, it really changes the picture because there's not going to be that push on climate legislation. However, there has been a lot of good legislation coming out of Congress in the last 5 years. It's really bipartisan. And so if Trump is reelected, I think we'll be focusing more on what can be introduced in the Senate, how to get some of these supports for nuclear put through legislation. It probably won't be through broader climate legislation. It might be nuclear specific legislation, but helping, there's still work that can be done to sort of reform markets, level the playing field a little bit. It's a little more challenging, though, if you don't have that focus on greenhouse gas emissions. And you do have a lot of support for fossil fuels from a Trump administration. So it makes it a little hard to level the playing field when they like how it's tilted. So more of a focus on Congress in that case, but also more of a focus at the state level. So there are companies that are starting licensing. There's already been an advanced reactor company that submitted a combined operating license. And so we could start to see projects in the next few years breaking ground. And so we need to be laying the groundwork for those either way. So doing more work at state level and community level, identifying where the best communities are for these projects and helping get them set up to do their own sort of community planning and about project evaluation. So it really changes the level that we'll be working at and where the nuclear policy will be happening, whether it's part of a big climate legislation or if it's nuclear specific legislation or more state or local level work.
Thank you. Very insightful. So a question has come in. Do you have thoughts on the economics of reuse of coal plants for SMRs? So is this something that utilities and coal plant operators are thinking about, leveraging existing infrastructure like power lines and rail access, et cetera?
Yeah, that is something people are thinking about. It's actually a project that we're going to be focusing on in our first year. And some of the SMR companies have also looked at, but intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. So coal power plants, especially the older ones, tend to be smaller, more on the like 500 to 600 megawatt size. So that's a good fit for a sort of set of SMRs. Like NuScale's plant with 12 units would be 720 megawatts. And they have some infrastructure that's really valuable, specifically transmission lines and then railroad sites for some of them. So, building new things is really hard in the US, particularly large infrastructure. So taking advantage of those brownfield sites definitely has value. So something we're going to be working on is figuring out how much value that actually has and what are sort of the regulatory obstacles to what's called repowering. So taking a coal plant and building an SMR on that site. And why this is really important, both politically and environmentally, is that there are a lot of coal plants that are set to retire in the next 5 to 10 years. And while that's really good from a climate perspective, we're taking all these polluting coal plants offline. For the local communities, it's really devastating. They lose their main source of employment in a lot of places. It's hard to retrain those workers. And so if there was an option that you could start to introduce early with some of these communities to say, well, how would you like a new power plant that in a lot of ways is pretty similar to what you have now. You're still boiling water to make electricity, that would employ more people, and not have the pollution that you had before with the coal plant. That seems like a pretty good option. And what would be the best is if you got communities that were really excited about that, and could help maybe accelerate the closing of their coal plant, or at least get a lot of community support for closing the coal plant and for building this new nuclear power plant in their community. And so that's what we're going to be looking at is, what would a pilot program for that look like? How much worker retraining is needed? How much of the infrastructure can you really reuse? And what do you still need to build fresh? But I think that is definitely could be a very economically attractive option.
So thank you again for all of the questions that are coming in. Lots of really great questions. I have one that's come in. Are there ways to address the challenges that U.S. nuclear vendors who compete with state-owned enterprises or heavily state-supported companies? So you had talked about the economics. That would be a great way to sort of address that, particularly with state-owned agencies.
Yeah, so this was actually the focus of the first chapter of my dissertation, which we have a paper published in Energy Policy that if you reach out to me, I can send it to you. But looked at how historically the US was the major exporter of commercial nuclear reactors and also fuel and services. But now that role has really shifted towards Russia's state-owned company, Rosatom, and also China was really like to get into the nuclear export market, and South Korea. And there's a lot of international relations and security concerns around that. But as I said, the U.S. has this boom of advanced nuclear. Boom is not the right word. They have a very thriving market of advanced reactor companies. There's only over 60 companies in the US working on advanced reactor design. So it seems like they'll have a really attractive product that a lot of countries that are interested in getting into nuclear power would like to have. But US nuclear companies don't come with a lot of the state supports that a Russia state-owned company does, like financing support, worker training, things like that. So it does look like it's difficult to compete for sure. And so some things that are needed are definitely help with financing. So there was a big change earlier this year. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation got rid of its policy prohibiting financing nuclear projects. So that's a really big deal. It means that they can, they're like an export finance organization through the US government. So they can finance nuclear projects now. So that could be a big help, particularly for smaller, for like SMRs, because it's still, they can't finance really huge projects. So that could definitely help. And also more financing through international agencies. So a lot of the big development banks and international financial institutions like IMF, they also have prohibitions on funding nuclear projects. And so that really needs to change. And there's people working on pushing for that change, specifically in the framework of climate change. We need a lot of low carbon energy, particularly in emerging economies and industrializing economies. And it's really hard to run a big industrial economy on wind and solar, particularly when they're more expensive right now in these places. So that's a big thing, financing. The other thing is that these big nuclear vendors that are competitive right now, like Russia, they want to build really large light water reactors. And what we're seeing, particularly from some smaller countries, is they really want SMRs. They really want advanced reactors for different reasons, particularly around water consumption and some of the passive safety features. And so if the US can get out in front of these with these advanced reactors, they may have an advantage in the market. So particularly around, the US isn't great at doing big infrastructure projects, but we're still pretty good at commercial products. Look at Boeing 787s, which are produced in the US, gas turbines, a lot of big equipment that the US is very good at building in a factory setting. If we can move nuclear towards that, I think the US could be very competitive. And that could also make it cheaper than these large projects. And also easier to do because you don't have to do construction in site in these newcomer countries, which has a lot of regulatory and safety hurdles as well. So if the reactor could be built in the US, shipped to the site, plugged in, that has a lot of advantages in terms of speed with which it could be built and ease of where it's built. So the US faces some disadvantages, but I think there can be some ways to overcome those.
Great. So we've opened the poll so that people can give us feedback on our topic today. And before we get to our final thoughts, I wanted to see what final thoughts you might have. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today that you want to make sure that you convey? I mean, what does the future of nuclear look like? Are we in a good position? What are your parting thoughts for us?
I think we're really at a turning point. For some people who are on the call might remember that we were talking about a nuclear renaissance in sort of the mid 2000s that didn't emerge for a lot of reasons. One of them is low natural gas prices. And so there definitely is a feeling that we could be going towards a nuclear renaissance now. But it's going to have to be focused around climate change mitigation. And that's really where nuclear's advantage lies. And so, building nuclear into a more holistic climate policy, I think is really important. And I've been surprised how fast some of these advanced nuclear companies have been moving towards commercialization. I think there's now 6 companies in pre-application activities with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So they're moving towards licensing. NuScale got their vendor design review. Oklo, which is a 1.5 megawatt microreactor, submitted their combined operating license. So they're moving really fast, and I think that's definitely surprising. And now it's sort of policy needs to catch up. We need to figure out how to finance these. So it's a really exciting time, and there's a lot of work to be done. Something that I get asked a lot from young people about. Well, I'm interested in nuclear, but I'm not an engineer. So what can I do? And right now, there's actually a lot you can do. There's a real need for people on the business side, on the financing side, to get involved, but also now on the social science side. So figuring out how to do proper community engagement, how to address historic injustice in the nuclear sector, and that's something that we haven't seen before. This focus on addressing all those issues. So it's definitely a turning point. I think it's an exciting time, but there's still a lot of challenges ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Jessica Levering, for your time this morning. We certainly appreciate your time. Looking forward to how things go next week, and we'll be thinking about how nuclear fits into kind of overarching policy. Going to give another couple of seconds for people to finish the poll. It's always helpful for us to know how people are thinking about the content and the topics, and nuclear seems to be an important topic for a lot of people. So thank you again, and I want to thank Daniela Grieman and Aswarya Raja for all the work that they've done in putting together these webinars. And thank you to you, Jessica. And we look forward to seeing everyone at a future event.
Yeah, and
thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for the good questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.